The town of Velik lived quietly between two hills and a narrow river that froze every winter like a held breath. Nothing extraordinary ever happened there. People worked, people aged, people disappeared into memory. The church bell rang at the same hours, and even sorrow followed predictable routines. At the very edge of town stood an old wooden house with faded blue shutters. Behind it, in a yard where grass struggled to grow, stood a small statue of the Virgin Mary. It had been there longer than most residents could remember. No one knew exactly who placed it. Some said it was an old widow after the war. Others said it had arrived even earlier, carried by hands that never stayed long enough to be known. Time had worn its surface smooth. Rain had softened the details. But the face remained unchanged, calm, patient, untouched by urgency. Inside the house lived a woman named Hannah. She was 36 years old and had learned, long ago, not to expect rescue. Her husband had left 3 winters ago, taking his voice, his warmth, and every promise that once filled the rooms. He left behind silence and unpaid bills. Hannah survived by working in the town bakery, waking before sunrise, returning after sunset. Her hands smelled of flour even in sleep. She did not pray, not anymore. Faith, she believed, was something people used before reality corrected them. One February morning, the cold arrived sharper than usual. The air cut through clothing and skin alike. Hannah stepped into the yard to gather firewood, her breath forming pale clouds. She paused. Something was different. For a moment, she could not explain it. The yard looked the same. The broken fence leaned at the same angle. The statue stood in its usual place. But there was something else. A thin layer of frost covered everything, except the statue. Hannah frowned and stepped closer. The ground around Mary's feet was clear, dark soil exposed while frost surrounded it like a boundary. Hannah crouched and touched the earth. It was warm, not hot, not impossible, just warmer than it should be. She pulled her hand back quickly, her heart beating faster. It didn't make sense. The temperature had fallen below freezing overnight. Even the river had begun to harden. Nothing should have been warm. Hannah stood there longer than she intended, staring at the statue's calm face. It did not look different. It did not glow. It did not move. It simply stood, watching. Hannah shook her head and turned away. She told herself it was nothing. Perhaps heat from the house escaped underground. Perhaps she imagined it. The mind, she knew, could create comfort where none existed. That night, the cold worsened. Wind pressed against the house like something alive. Wood creaked. Windows whispered. Hannah lay awake in bed, staring into darkness. She thought about the statue. She didn't want to, but the thought returned. Warm earth in frozen winter. She closed her eyes. Sleep came slowly, and sometime deep in the night, she dreamed. She stood in the yard, snow falling silently. The statue stood before her, unchanged. But now, she was not alone. A presence stood beside her. Not seen, not heard, but known. It did not speak. It did not need to. The silence itself felt like understanding. Hannah woke before dawn, breath uneven, heart unsettled. The dream faded quickly, like all dreams do. But something remained. Not proof, not certainty, only a question. And in the cold yard behind the house, the statue waited. Morning in Velik came gray and silent, as if the sky itself didn't want to get involved. Hannah went to work like always, tying her hair back, pulling on her worn coat, stepping into the street with the same disciplined numbness. The bakery was warm, the ovens roaring, the scent of bread thick enough to feel like comfort. People came for rolls, for loaves, for small talk they didn't mean. Hannah smiled when she had to. She counted coins. She wiped counters. She avoided looking too long at anyone's eyes. But all day, behind every routine movement, the statue stayed in her mind. Warm earth, a dream that felt too quiet to ignore. By late afternoon, the wind grew sharper. Snow began as dust, then thickened into real flakes that spun in the air like ash. Hannah finished her shift, walked home with her shoulders braced against the cold. Her boots crunched over frozen ground. Every step felt heavier than usual, not from fatigue, but from an invisible pull drawing her toward the yard. She didn't go inside right away. Instead, she opened the back door and stepped out. The yard looked brutal under winter. The fence leaned, the branches hung stiff, and the statue stood in its familiar place. Hands together, head slightly bowed, as if in endless prayer. The frost had returned, thin and white across the grass. Hannah approached slowly. Again, the ground around the statue was clear. Again, the soil looked darker, softer, like it belonged to a different season. She crouched and pressed 2 fingers into it. Warm. Not imagined. Not coincidence. Hannah sat back on her heels, staring as if her eyes could force an explanation out of the air. A noise came from the neighboring yard, an old gate creaking open. Hannah turned and saw Mrs. Kovalchuk, a widow who lived alone, wrapped in a shawl, carrying a bucket. The woman stopped when she noticed Hannah near the statue. "You felt it too," Mrs. Kovalchuk said quietly. Hannah's throat tightened. "What?" The widow took a step closer, eyes fixed on the ground. "The warmth. I've been watching for 3 days." Hannah stood quickly. "It's probably something under the ground. Pipes." Mrs. Kovalchuk gave a tired smile. "There are no pipes here, Hannah. Not in these yards. We heat with wood like our grandparents did." Hannah didn't answer. The widow reached into her coat and pulled out a small candle. Cheap wax, the kind sold at the church for a few coins. She held it as if it were delicate. "I'm not asking you to believe," she said. "Only to let me place this here." Hannah hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse. To protect her yard from rumors, from attention, from the pressure of people's hopes. But another part, the part that had woken up unsettled before dawn, stood silent and opened a gate inside her. She stepped aside. Mrs. Kovalchuk knelt with difficulty, set the candle on a flat stone near the statue's base, and lit it with a trembling match. The flame caught instantly, rising thin and steady. The wind moved through the yard. Snow swirled, yet the flame didn't bend. It stood upright as if the air around it had grown calm. Hannah stared, her pulse climbing. The widow closed her eyes. Her lips moved without sound. Not dramatic, not desperate. Just a quiet sentence spoken to someone she trusted. When she finished, she opened her eyes again. They were wet. "My son," she whispered. "He's in Kharkiv. I haven't heard from him in 9 days." Hannah's chest tightened. She wanted to say something. Something practical, something safe. But no words were enough for a fear like that. Mrs. Kovalchuk stood and placed her hand lightly on Hannah's arm, as if passing a fragile responsibility. "Sometimes," she said, "we need a place to stand when we are falling." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Hannah alone with the statue and the candle. The flame burned quietly in the snow. Hannah remained there until her fingers went numb. She wasn't praying. Not yet. But for the first time in years, she felt something she had forgotten how to name. Not certainty. Not faith. Only a thin, trembling thread that whispered, "Maybe you are not alone." And the statue, unchanged, silent, patient, held that thread without breaking it. 2 days later the candle was still there. Hannah expected it to melt into a useless stump or get blown out by the wind. She expected snow to bury it, rain to drown it, or simple bad luck to prove that nothing in the world stayed lit for long. But every time she stepped into the yard, the glassy flame was waiting, small, steady, stubborn. More than that, the warmth remained. The circle of dark soil around the statue widened by inches, as if winter was being politely pushed back. Hannah started checking it like a habit, pressing her fingers into the earth every morning before work. Each time it felt wrong in the same way, warm enough to be alive. On Thursday evening, she noticed footprints in the snow. Not hers. They curved from the gate toward the statue and back again. The steps were careful, respectful, like someone approaching an old grave. Hannah stood in the kitchen window and watched the yard for a long time, half expecting to see a figure return. No one did. But the next morning, a second candle appeared beside the first. And next to it, a single white flower, impossible in February, laid gently at Mary's feet. Hannah's first reaction was anger. The second was fear. She didn't want this. She didn't want people in her yard, leaving symbols, expecting answers. She didn't want rumors turning her life into a story she couldn't control. She worked, she survived, she stayed quiet. That was her entire system of safety. Yet when she stepped closer and saw the flower, its petals clean and bright against the dark soil, something inside her softened before she could stop it. That afternoon, after her shift, Hannah heard voices outside her fence. She opened the back door and froze. 3 women stood near the gate, hands clasped. One of them was Mrs. Kovalchuk. The other 2 Hannah recognized from church, serious, careful women who always spoke in lowered voices. Mrs. Kovalchuk saw Hannah and gave a small nod, as if asking permission without words. Hannah hesitated, then opened the gate. They entered slowly, like people stepping into a room where someone sleeps. No one touched the statue. No one spoke loudly. They approached the candles, the flower, and the warm soil as if it were fragile. One of the church women began to cry without sound. "My daughter," she whispered. "She's in hospital. They don't know what it is." The other woman touched her shoulder and said a prayer so quiet Hannah barely heard it. The words sounded worn and familiar, like a song sung in the dark by someone who has sung it many times. Hannah stood by the fence, arms folded, heart tight. She wanted to tell them to leave, but she couldn't. Not because she believed, because she could see what they carried. People didn't come here for entertainment. They came because life had cornered them, and they needed somewhere to set down their fear for a minute. Even if the place was only a cold yard with a statue and a candle that refused to die. By the weekend, more came. Not crowds, just one or two at a time. A man in a work jacket who stood with his hat in his hands, staring at Mary's face as if memorizing it. A teenage girl who left a note folded into a tiny square. An old couple who held hands and didn't say anything at all. Hannah tried to keep order. She placed a small wooden box near the gate for candles so they wouldn't burn the grass. She hung a handwritten sign, "Please be quiet. This is a home." People obeyed, but stories moved faster than signs. On Monday, a young man with a phone appeared outside the fence, filming. "Is it true the ground is warm?" he asked, too excited. "Is it true the candle doesn't blow out?" Hannah's stomach turned. "Don't film my house." He laughed. "This is news. People deserve to see it." Hannah stepped forward. "Leave." He kept filming. "Are you making money off this? Is it a trick?" Something hard rose in Hannah's chest. "Go," she repeated, voice lower. He leaned closer, pushing his phone through the fence for a better angle, toward the statue, toward the candles, toward the flower. And then the wind hit. It came sudden and sharp, a single violent gust that slammed into the fence and forced the man backward. His phone slipped from his hand and fell into the snow. He cursed, stumbling, eyes wide. The yard behind him stayed strangely still. The candle flames didn't even bend. He grabbed his phone, shaking, and backed away as if he'd touched something he didn't understand. "This is crazy," he muttered, then ran down the street. Hannah stood frozen, breath visible, skin prickling. She looked at the statue. Mary's face was calm, unmoved, unchanged. But Hannah felt it now, an invisible line drawn in the air. Not a show, a boundary. That night, Hannah didn't lock the gate. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, listening to the wind outside, thinking of the women crying in her yard, the man filming, the candle flames standing steady like tiny guards. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew something was happening. And whether she wanted it or not, the quiet statue had begun pulling people toward it, one by one, like a lighthouse on a dark shore. Spring arrived slowly, like something unsure of its welcome. Snow retreated in patches, leaving behind wet soil and flattened grass. The river loosened its frozen grip and began to move again, its surface breaking into quiet currents. The air still held cold in the mornings, but it no longer felt permanent. The statue remained. The candles came and went, replaced by new ones when old flames died. Flowers appeared more often now, real ones, possible ones. White, yellow, sometimes red. People still visited, though fewer than before. The excitement had faded, replaced by something calmer, something deeper. Hannah no longer watched from the window. She stood in the yard with them, not as a believer, not as a guide, only as someone who understood why they came. One morning, Mrs. Kovalchuk knocked on her door, breathless. "He called," the old woman said. Hannah blinked. "Your son." The widow nodded, tears already forming. "He's alive. He said his phone was destroyed. He found another. He's safe." Hannah felt warmth spread through her chest, quiet and unexpected. She wanted to say it was coincidence. War spared some, took others. That was the nature of it. But she didn't say it. She simply held the woman's hands while she cried. Later that day, Hannah stepped into the yard alone. The circle of warm earth had faded. When she touched it now, it felt like normal soil, cool, ordinary, part of the same world again. The statue stood unchanged, hands together, face patient as ever. Nothing moved. Nothing glowed. Nothing proved anything. And yet everything felt different. Hannah realized the warmth hadn't disappeared. It had moved somewhere else. Inside people. Inside herself. She thought of the visitors who had stood there shaking, carrying invisible weights. Some left with relief. Some left with nothing but the comfort of being heard. But none left exactly as they arrived. The statue had not spoken. It had not moved. It had simply remained. And sometimes, Hannah understood, remaining was the miracle. That evening, a young girl came alone. She couldn't have been older than 10. She held no candle, no flower. Only stood there, staring up at Mary's face. Hannah approached slowly. "Are you looking for something?" The girl shrugged. "My father died last week." The words landed heavy in the air. Hannah didn't offer explanations. She didn't offer promises. She only stood beside her. After a moment, the girl asked, "Does she bring people back?" Hannah swallowed. "No," she said gently. The girl nodded, as if she expected that answer. "Then what does she do?" Hannah looked at the statue, at the calm expression carved into its face. "She searched for truth, not comfort." "She stays," Hannah said. The girl frowned slightly. "When everything leaves," Hannah continued, "she stays. So you don't feel completely alone." The girl looked at the statue again. Her shoulders relaxed just a little. After a while, she turned and walked away. Hannah remained. The sun lowered behind the hills, its light turning the statue gold for a brief moment before fading into shadow. Hannah realized she no longer needed proof. She had spent years believing that faith required certainty. That belief meant knowing something was real beyond doubt. Now she understood something else. Faith was not certainty. Faith was standing in the cold, in the silence, in the unanswered questions, and not running away. The statue had not changed the laws of the world. People still suffered. People still left. People still died. But in one small yard, something had reminded them of what remained when everything else was taken. Presence. Stillness. Hope. Fragile and quiet. Hannah stepped forward and brushed a thin layer of dust from the statue's base. "Thank you," she whispered. Not because she had received everything she wanted, but because she had received enough to continue. The wind moved gently through the yard, no longer violent, no longer testing. Just wind. The statue stood as it always had. Silent, patient, and no longer alone.